Welcome back. This is episode 2 of our 14-part study. In our last time together, we introduced this investigation and we looked carefully at a foundational, undeniable principle of Scripture. A clean thing cannot come from an unclean. It's a principle that, well, it simply wouldn't leave me alone. It demanded a deeper look. Today, that principle meets its first real test, and the test happens in the very place where honey is actually made. But I need to invite you somewhere first. Because before we open Scripture together, before we look at what Torah actually says, I need you to see something with your own eyes.
Come inside a beehive with me. And I don't mean the picture on the honey jar or that pristine illustration from a children's book. I mean the real thing. And I need you to come in not as a scientist, but simply as a witness. Step inside. Because what actually goes on in there surprised me, and it completely changed how I read Scripture on honey forever. Now, the first thing you notice inside is the movement. Thousands upon thousands of bees, working, constantly working. You see, a worker bee born in the active summer season lives about 3 to 7 weeks. In those few short weeks, she literally works herself into the ground, collecting nectar, producing wax from her own body, feeding the brood, tending the structure. Every single one of those weeks is intensely, relentlessly active. And at the end of them, she simply dies.
That's the second thing you'd notice. In a healthy summer hive, between 800 and 1,200 bees die every single day. Every day. And that's not because something is wrong. It's not because of a disease or a failure in the colony. That is simply the normal baseline rhythm of a hive. Birth and death running side by side at the exact same pace all the time. To replace these massive daily losses, the queen lays roughly 1,500 eggs a day. It is the only way a hive stays alive.
Now, the colony does have workers whose specific job is to handle the dead. They're called Undertaker bees. They lift the corpses and carry them out of the hive. It is a real job that a real bee does. But here's the thing. They cannot get all of them all the time. Cold nights slow them down. Rain stops them entirely. And the sheer, overwhelming crowding inside the hive gets in the way of their work. And so, inevitably, some bees simply die where they are. Their bodies stay right in place, directly in the shared spaces of the hive, right among the living, right among the brood being cared for, and right among the food being stored.
This is the part I want you to see clearly, because it's the part I had never really thought about before. Honey doesn't ripen off to the side in some clean, separate, isolated chamber. Honey ripens in wax comb cells built inside that exact same physical structure. The comb itself is made from beeswax the bees secrete from their own bodies. The honey cells sit interspersed with the brood cells, with the pollen storage, with the general spaces where bees live and work and die. There is no wall between them. Dead bees and developing honey are not separate realities. They share one single vessel. The unvarnished physical truth is this: death has been in continuous contact with the food we call sweet.
You don't have to take my word for any of this. Beekeeping guides say it plainly. Freshly extracted honey, before it ever hits the bottle on your shelf, contains bits of pollen, beeswax, propolis, and yes, bee parts. Their own filtering guides walk through it step by step. They tell you to start with a coarse strainer to catch the big debris like wax chunks and bee parts, and then move to a finer strainer for the smaller pieces. It is routine, it is expected, beekeepers plan for it. This contact with death is not a manufacturing error, it's not a flaw in the system, that is the actual mechanism of the hive.
Now, I am not telling you this to attack beekeepers. Beekeeping is honest work. And to be absolutely clear, beekeepers are the ones who taught me what I just told you. And I'm not saying anyone in the church or the synagogue has been hiding anything maliciously. I'm just telling you what surprised me. Because in every religious conversation I had ever been part of, honey came up only in the context of blessing. Milk and honey, sweeter than honey, the praise of it. But what actually happens inside the physical place where honey is made never came up, not once. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it.
Because now I had a real question, a profound question. And it wasn't about beekeepers, it wasn't about the honey industry. My question was about Yahweh. If dead, biblically unclean creatures are in continuous contact with honey the whole time it is being made, what does Torah actually say about food that has contacted death? That is when I went back to Leviticus 11. And what I read finished the sentence I had just started asking. Now in that broader passage, there's a phrase, on which water comes, that a whole tradition has built a defense of honey around. We are going to give that phrase a full episode of its own later in this series, because it deserves a real, thorough answer. Set it aside for just a moment, and look at what the verse actually says about food and drink. Any food in it that could be eaten on which water comes shall be unclean, and all drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. Leviticus 11:34. Notice what carries the weight here. Death. Food or drink that a dead, unclean, swarming creature has touched becomes unclean. That is the ruling. That is the verdict from the mouth of God.
And notice something else. Torah is incredibly precise about its exceptions. Just 2 verses later, in Leviticus 11:36, if a dead swarming thing falls into a natural spring or a gathered cistern of water, Yahweh says the water itself remains clean. Those specific bodies of water are exempted. So God knew exactly how to name an exception when there was one. He was very clear. He provided a remedy for springs and cisterns. It just never names an exception for food, and it never names an exception for drink.
In case you think I might be reading a bit too much into this, the prophet Haggai puts the exact same question to the priests. These were the men whose whole office existed to rule on questions exactly like this. He uses ordinary kitchen items in his question: bread, stew, wine, and oil. Not altar sacrifices, but regular, everyday home foods. And the priests answer without hesitation: if someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? The priests answered and said, it does become unclean. Haggai 2:13. The verdict is plain, and it is unyielding. Food that contacts death becomes unclean.
Now put both of these things next to each other. On one side, what you just saw when we stepped inside the hive. Dead bees in continuous contact with the honey the whole time it is being made. On the other side, what Torah plainly says about food that has contacted death, unclean, and no remedy offered. These two facts weren't in different books. They were both true. They were both realities of creation in Scripture. I just had never put them together before. When I finally did, that was a profound personal revelation for me, and a real shock. For so much of my life I had heard the religious teaching about honey, the sweetness, the blessing, the rich imagery. But I had never once been asked to think about what actually goes on inside the physical place where honey is made, or about what Torah says happens to food that has been in contact with death. Both were true, and when they finally met in my understanding, they said something I simply did not expect them to say.
That is what I saw. That is the tension that set the rest of this study in motion. The very next question I had was probably the exact same one you are about to ask. If this is really the case, if this verdict is unyielding, then what about all the places Scripture speaks warmly of honey? What about the land flowing with milk and honey? Sweeter than honey. Doesn't that settle it? That is a serious question, and it deserves a real biblical answer. And that answer starts with a single word, the actual Hebrew word behind our English translation of honey. A word that is doing much more work than most of us realize. That is exactly where we will go next.